last couple weeks. But I was ready to call the doctor and say, look, I'm not happy with this at all. But then I talked with a guy today that had both of them done. 3 weeks before I had mine done. So I called up, I talked to him before I had mine done, and to find out what it was all about, and he told me. And so anyhow, I called him again this morning because I'm unhappy with the thing. It doesn't seem to be, I'm still quite a bit of pain. I've now been 6 weeks, 2 months, 8 weeks, and I'm still in quite a bit of pain and can't walk very far. So I called him up and see what he said, and also I had some other things. I had some knocking in my knee, scraping, like bones scraping together. Right. Goes on and on. So I asked him. I said, I asked him about the scraping. He said, "Oh, mine did the same thing. That's part of it." And I said, "Well, I told him I had mine August 18th, which made 3 weeks after him. So at this date today, he's 3 weeks ahead of me, and
right.
And so I asked him what he thought about my progress, and told him about. He said, "Well, Jesus, I think you're doing all right." He's just recently been able to sleep decently at night. His legs have been bothering him all this time, and last night, the night before, and one night last week, I had great night's sleep.
Oh yeah.
The leg keeps bothering you. It hurts you, and you move. So I'm getting now. So I'm almost up to him, and he's 3 weeks ahead of me.
Right.
So I guess I'm not too bad off. I guess I'm a little impatient.
Yeah. I think that's it. Because do you remember I was telling you about that hockey coach that
Yeah.
got his done, I don't know, what was it, about a month before yours?
Yeah.
He just this week went back to work.
Oh, he did?
Now, yeah.
And he a month ahead of me? I see. Well, then I'm not so bad off.
That's what I'm saying. He's not that, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much age matters on the healing
Well,
process,
I don't know
but
either.
I'm sure he's 25 years younger than you.
Yeah, well, the same way with this guy. He's 60, so he's 36 years younger than me. Wait a minute, 26 years younger.
Right.
Not making it any worse than it is. And
But I'm
so
sure
anyhow.
I'm sure that will have a little effect.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure he'll more slowly because of your age.
Yeah, well, I didn't mention my age to him. He didn't know how old I was. I think if I had mentioned my age, he'd say, "Well, geez, what's your hurry? It's your age, And so, anyhow, it's sure drags.
You're just not used to
No, I'm not.
injury.
This is the only operation outside of my tonsils and adenoids. Oh, and I had I never can think of the word, prostate operation.
Yeah.
But that was nothing to
Right.
that. But other than that, I haven't had one my entire life. This is a major deal. Well, it's a major deal to anybody.
It's a major deal.
Yeah.
But you should talk to those guys like Brett. They're out for a year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Well, I guess I'm just over anxious because I haven't got a lot of years left, and I've got a lot of things I want to do. And this guy is slowing me down.
You got a lot of years ahead.
I think so. I feel like I have.
Yeah. That's good. In the long run, you'll be glad you did it. Are you on still?
Yeah.
The just getting back to the other thing, I just had a couple questions following up the war and the post-war. Was once you found out, I know we touched on this a little bit, what was the initial news that was heard about what the Nazis had done, like in the war camps and in the concentration camps and things like that? Did the news come over slowly about that, or during the war did people know about it?
We didn't know. We didn't know much about that. Now, I don't know why. Well, as a matter of fact, well into the war, even the Allies, the soldiers, and those over fighting in Germany, were not aware of what was going on with the Jews, to the extent that it was going on. He knew that there was a persecution, but they'd see where probably 20 of them were killed here and there were 50 killed over there, not thousands. And so, no, we didn't hear much about that, which is about the only excuse we have for having that, for not welcoming those that came over in that boat that I told you about earlier. After we found out what was going over there, we felt like a bunch of real chumps for not doing what we could for that little group. And as a matter of fact, later on, I guess most of this was after the war, but Germany was destitute. The Germans were destitute, but of all the people who were destitute, the Jews were the most destitute because nobody had anything to do with them, you know. So we have a city that was built in New York for the Jews from Germany, and we made them at home here, which made up to some degree for what we hadn't done before. And not only that, but they were welcomed in here along with all the other immigrants. About we were asked about knowing about the camps. It was late in the war when we finally started getting some word about that. And I don't know, it was, I think, about the earliest we found out for true that it was, because it was hard to believe, was when our allies and our people, our soldiers, American soldiers and so forth, finally got in there and raided those camps. You know, they got far enough into Germany, they got into the camps. See, before the camps were we weren't there yet.
Right.
But when we got onto it, boy, then we got the pictures, and then we got the story. It came over quick, and it was unbelievable. And
see, that was kind of why I was asking those questions about propaganda and things like that, because I think, to me, part of what happened maybe was that you didn't believe it, and you didn't believe it because you had heard U.S. propaganda before talking bad about the Japanese and the Germans, and you thought, oh, this is just another thing they're saying to make people hate Germans.
Yeah, you won't take everything for a fact that you hear, that's for sure. And without visual evidence or something like that, probably if we did hear about the camps, we'd probably say, hey, that can't be. That's impossible to believe. But it did happen over there. And when Bonnie and Joanne and I were over there in Germany, we went to Dachau, one of the concentration camps. And the buildings were all torn down. Just the foundations were still left there, except for some of the buildings. One of the buildings had the ovens in it. You can see the ovens there and everything else. And also they had a bunch of hooks about this far apart across the beam. And that's what they hung them on. They'd hang them on those hooks there. There must have been 20 of them. And in another part of it, in those buildings were way off on one end, and then you had to walk past all of these barracks, we'll call them, that were torn down, and just the foundations. Then over here was the entrance and kind of a visitor's place, which was a large place of the same vintage, the building. and full of pictures, photographs, all over the place. And man, what a ghastly thing to see. Just, boy, any possible way they could tear a person apart and kill them, they were doing it.
But
No.
I guess, did you ever meet anyone that was a Holocaust survivor or talk to anyone? I don't know if that's.
No, I don't remember. I wouldn't say I haven't, but I wasn't aware of it. Because the only way you're aware of it is if they tell you, or if you see the tattoo on her arm. They're all tattooed.
Right. What about following up that? I know soon thereafter, I think in 1948, they created the state of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember the goings on of that? How people perceived that? I know it was a pretty. In the United States, they thought of it as a positive thing, I believe. Do you remember your perception on that happening at that time?
Well, I didn't pay a lot of attention to it, just like anybody else. I mean, it's just another world event that goes on in the background of your daily life. You know, you just don't pay too much attention to it. But it all depends on what side of the fence you're on, whether you think it's justified or not. From the Jew standpoint, it's justified because that was their home for thousands of years. And it was particularly necessary now to open it up to them because so many of them were now running loose with nothing in Europe. Those that lived had nothing. They needed a place to go. And that's the justification from the Jewish side. From the Palestinian side, they fought it because in recent years, it had been Palestine, you know, and had been over quite a number of years. And of course, at one time or another, they got it away from the Jews. How they did it, I don't know, but nevertheless, they did. And it wasn't a battle. The Jews didn't get it with a battle, which is a normal way. The British, who were in charge of that area over there, decided that the Jews were going to get a piece of it and blocked off this hunk which became Jerusalem. Or not Jerusalem, but Israel. And imported all these Jews in there, and that was a horrible, horrible situation for a long time because it's not a productive country. I mean, you can't grow or couldn't grow anything outside of olives or something like that, and very little water, and fighting with the Palestinians and so forth. But in spite of all of that, they finally grubbed out made some irrigation ditches and started making it. Now I haven't seen it myself, but I understand Jerusalem, or Israel flourishes now, particularly where the Jewish people have it. They've made a garden out of the place, and which is something the Arabs never did. They're just not inclined to it. It's just like the Indians here are not inclined to be farmers. And it's the same way with the Palestinians. And yes, right. So let's see what now.
Well, that's okay. I'm ready to. I wanted to ask you about Stalin and what happened in Russia, especially after the war, because before we entered the war and before Germany attacked Russia, Stalin had entered a treaty with Hitler, with Germany. And then obviously when Germany went ahead and attacked Russia, that was broken, and Russia immediately became an ally when before they were always not an enemy, but obviously not an ally.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we were.
And then after the war, because they were an ally during the war, Britain and the United States were forced to deal with Russia and ended up conceding a lot of things to Russia, like
right.
Poland, like
Yeah.
Czechoslovakia, and those
Yeah.
kinds of things. Here in the United States, did anyone sense or feel the capabilities that Stalin had as far as you know, the way that he went about business, sort of similar to the way Hitler did things, just not quite so proactive?
We thought of Stalin as much as we did about Hitler, in much the same way. Except that, of course, our animosity towards him was soft-pedaled when he became our ally. But previous to that, I mean, he had a record of killing over in Russia there through the 30s, ever since he got into power after Lenin died, and he did Trotsky out of it. Why, then he became the kingpin, and he decided all the land was going to be owned by the government, and he put out a decree that any landholder that objects and won't give up their land, kill them. And over a period of time, something like 23 million Russians were slaughtered because of that, or put in camps up in gulags up in Siberia. So we knew that even before the Second World War. So it was difficult for us to say, hey, he's on our side now, you know, and treat him as a civilized person. And so after the war, after he'd been our ally for those years during the war, we had a little softer opinion of him, because we would show pictures of him and Churchill and Roosevelt sitting together and smiling and everything else. It looked like a Gold Dust twins. And but anyhow, it's true. For reasons I don't know, we gave Russia a lot of stuff that they shouldn't have had. I mean, they had nothing really to do with getting those areas back from Hitler on the eastern part of Germany. They had something to do with it, but actually they spent most of their time fighting holding them back on their own country, where we were going through and getting to Poland and the rest of them, and we with our equipment that we were giving them. So what we should have done is said, well, thanks for the help, and we'll see you later, and that's it, because we gave them more than they gave us, except the fact that they, well, I guess you got to give them a lot of credit, although they didn't earn it, and that is the very fact that they are a big country with thousands and thousands of people over there that overwhelmed the Germans, which helped us in the war. But that wasn't Hitler's doing. That's just, or that wasn't Stalin's work necessarily. It's just the fact that he had that big mass of people to stop him.
Had public sentiment here in the States, though, did you remember feeling differently about Stalin after the war than before the war?
Well, I never liked Stalin. I had heard about what he had done over there before the war, and he had a bad reputation, because he was killing. We got all kinds of stories out of Russia of some of these crazy trials that he had and everything. I mean, he was killing lots and lots of people, and they with cooked up deal. Well, I'll tell you, everybody was a spy over there. If you thought your neighbor was doing something that the government didn't like or something, you told the gendarmes or the KGB or whatever it was, and they'd take your word for it. They'd take the guy in and torch him and everything else. And so anyhow, you were somebody I didn't like very well, I'd just, hey, get him. And they would. And boy, the number of innocent people over there that were torn apart in those torture chambers was for nothing, just because somebody would say, hey, he's got a lot of gold hid. So what kind of a defense have you got against that? You know, and say, yes, you have got it. Tell us where it is, you know. And they tortured until you either killed you or gave up on you, one or the other. So these things we knew. I read a couple books about Hitler's gulags and things like that before the Second World War. It was sickening.
But did you know about it though at the time? I mean, I know you said you heard about some things, but during the course of the war, did your idea of Stalin personally change at the time?
No, not at all. And I don't suppose many of the Americans actually changed. I mean, if you'd ask them, what do you think of Stalin? I'd say, I hate the sucker, you know. But we got to live with him, and that's what the circumstance was. We hate him, but we got to live with him. And of course, after the war was and everything else, we went back to hating again, because for a few other reasons, he got off with a lot more than he had coming. Even getting a slice off of Japan. He didn't put a soldier in Japan. We did everything over there, and yet he went in there and ransacked all the factories and everything else and took out everything else as his loot. And we didn't even do that. We didn't take any loot out of there, but they did. So no, and he kept on killing people right and left, everything. So he's one of the world's worst. Actually, in fact, I think as far as the total amount of people killed at his word is probably worse than the Genghis Khan or some of the other great killers of history. Because you take, I don't know what it was by the time he died, but the figure 23 million came out of the war right after the war. And so 23 million is a lot of people. And I don't know, I know Genghis Khan covered a lot of territory all the way from northeastern China and Mongolia all the way across the Gobi Desert and into Mid-East, what we now call the Mid-East.
Right.
He was down to Turkey. He got into Turkey, and he was all over the place, and he slaughtered everybody as he went. So we've had a number of them in history, but those two are probably the worst.
I know before the war, communism, the kind of communism that Stalin was utilizing was becoming fairly unpopular, especially in the United States. Just give me your impressions of maybe the first time you heard about communism and what did they talk about when they talked about communism before? I mean, nowadays we have the Soviet picture of what communism is.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, in the 20s, even like just after the Russian Revolution, I'm sure people here in the United States didn't see communism like we do now. They
No.
saw it as something different. Tell me.
I didn't know what it was yet.
Right.
I'm going to keep tearing this thing off. What were we talking about?
What was the first time that you heard what communism was, and what was your impression?
Well, after the war, we had a big communist scare here.